In the winter of 1916, along the muddy banks of the Meuse River, the ancient fortress city of Verdun stood like a sentinel against the grey February sky. Its stone walls had witnessed centuries of conflict, but nothing could have prepared this hallowed ground for what was about to unfold. Over the next 10 months, this quiet corner of northeastern France would become the epicenter of the most brutal and sustained battle in human history, a grinding inferno of steel and flesh that would consume over 700,000 lives and forever change the nature of warfare itself. This is the story of Verdun, where the very concept of heroism was redefined in trenches carved from blood and mud, where men fought not for glory or conquest, but for mere survival in a landscape transformed into hell on earth. Here, beneath skies darkened by smoke and shrapnel, the French army would face its greatest test, while the German war machine unleashed a calculated campaign of destruction designed not merely to capture territory, but to bleed France white until it could fight no more. The year 1916 dawned with Europe locked in the grip of the Great War's second winter. Across the Western Front, millions of soldiers huddled in waterlogged trenches, separated by barbed wire and the deadly expanse of no man's land. The war of movement that both sides had envisioned in 1914 had long since collapsed into a stalemate of unprecedented proportions. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a jagged scar of fortifications, trenches, and death stretched for over 400 miles. By early 1916, the romantic notions of quick victory and glorious charges had been shattered against the realities of modern warfare. The machine gun, barbed wire, and high-explosive shells had turned the battlefield into a slaughterhouse where attacks measured in yards cost thousands of lives. Yet despite the mounting carnage, neither side showed any willingness to seek peace. Instead, military planners on both sides desperately searched for the key that would unlock the stalemate and bring decisive victory. In his headquarters at Pless, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn studied the maps spread across his desk with the cold calculation of a chess master. A Prussian officer schooled in the ruthless efficiency of the German General Staff, Falkenhayn had concluded that the war could no longer be won through brilliant maneuvers or decisive battles. The mathematics of modern warfare were brutally simple. Victory would go to whichever side could endure the longest, could absorb the most punishment, and could inflict the most damage on their enemies. Britain, he reasoned, remained safely protected by the Royal Navy and the English Channel. Russia, though wounded by devastating defeats in East Prussia and Poland, possessed vast reserves of men and territory. But France was different. Squeezed between the German lines and the sea, with her most industrialized regions under enemy occupation, France was vulnerable in ways her allies were not. More importantly, France carried the psychological weight of fighting on her own soil, defending not just strategic positions, but the very heart of the nation. Falkenhayn's plan was as methodical as it was merciless. He would select a target so precious to French national pride that France would be compelled to defend it at any cost. Then, using Germany's superiority in artillery and defensive positions, he would turn that target into a killing ground where French divisions would be fed into the meat grinder until the French army bled to death. The target he chose was Verdun. The selection was strategically brilliant. Verdun occupied a dangerous salient in the French lines, a bulge that jutted into German-held territory, like a dagger pointed at the heart of German communications. More importantly, Verdun was woven into the very fabric of French history and national identity. This ancient fortress city had stood guard over the approaches to Paris for over 1,000 years. Here, Charlemagne's empire had been divided among his grandsons in 843. Here, French armies had turned back countless invasions from the east. To abandon Verdun would be to tear at the soul of France itself. What made Verdun even more attractive to German planners was its apparent vulnerability. In a decision that would prove catastrophic, French High Command had systematically weakened Verdun's defenses throughout 1915. Believing that the age of fortresses had passed, General Joseph Joffre had ordered the removal of most of Verdun's heavy artillery. Over 600 tons of ammunition and 237 guns were stripped from the fortress ring and sent to support offensives elsewhere. The mighty fortifications that had once bristled with cannon were reduced to hollow shells, manned by skeleton crews of middle-aged reservists. The irony was bitter. In their rush to embrace offensive warfare, French military leaders had gutted the very defenses they would soon desperately need. The fortress system that should have anchored the defense of Verdun had been deliberately dismantled by the very men whose job it was to protect it. As winter gave way to spring in 1916, German preparations intensified. Along a front barely 20 miles wide, the largest concentration of artillery in military history began to take shape. 808 guns, ranging from field pieces to massive siege mortars, were positioned with scientific precision. Railway lines snaked through the forests behind German lines, delivering an endless stream of shells. Engineers surveyed every yard of the target area, calculating firing data with mathematical exactness. The German plan, codenamed Operation Judgment, was designed to unfold like a mechanical process. The opening bombardment would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. For 10 hours, over 1 million shells would rain down on French positions, pulverizing trenches, destroying communications, and shattering the morale of any defenders who survived. Then, methodically, German infantry would advance to occupy the devastated ground, while artillery observers moved forward to direct fire onto the next line of French positions. The beauty of the plan, from Falkenhayn's perspective, lay in its sustainability. Unlike the massive offensives launched by both sides in 1915, this attack was designed not to break through, but to grind forward relentlessly. Each day, German forces would advance a few hundred yards, forcing the French to counterattack across open ground, swept by German machine guns and artillery. The French would be compelled to throw division after division into the furnace, while German casualties would remain manageable. It was warfare reduced to an industrial process, a factory of death designed to consume French manpower at an unsustainable rate. Falkenhayn calculated that for every German soldier lost, 2 or 3 Frenchmen would die. Given Germany's larger population and stronger industrial base, this arithmetic of attrition seemed to guarantee victory. On the French side, the warnings were there for those willing to see them. Intelligence reports spoke of massive German preparations around Verdun. French aviators reported endless columns of trucks and trains moving toward the German lines. Local commanders pleaded for reinforcements and supplies. Yet French High Command, obsessed with their own offensive plans, dismissed these concerns. Verdun, they believed, could hold itself. This complacency would prove to be one of the costliest miscalculations in military history. As February 1916 drew to a close, the stage was set for a confrontation that would dwarf every battle that had come before. On one side stood the methodical precision of the German war machine, backed by the largest artillery concentration ever assembled. On the other stood the undermanned, under-equipped defenders of Verdun, unaware that they were about to face 10 months of continuous hell. The morning of February 21st dawned grey and misty over the Meuse Valley. In German observation posts, artillery officers peered through the gloom, waiting for the fog to lift enough to begin their work. In French trenches, soldiers went about their morning routines, unaware that they were living through the last moments of the old world. At 7:15 on the morning of February 21st, the earth itself seemed to convalesce in terror. The German artillery bombardment that erupted across the Verdun sector was not merely an attack. It was the birth cry of a new age of warfare. 808 guns spoke as one, their voices merging into a continuous roar that could be heard 100 miles away in Paris. The sound was unlike anything human ears had ever experienced, a mechanical thunder that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. From the German lines, the barrage appeared almost beautiful in its terrible precision. Shells arced through the morning air in perfect trajectories, their whistling descent creating a deadly symphony. But for the French soldiers huddled in their trenches, beauty was the furthest thing from their minds. The world around them simply ceased to exist, replaced by a hellscape of exploding earth and flying steel. The bombardment had been calculated to destroy not just fortifications and men, but hope itself. German gunners had divided the target area into precise squares on their maps, methodically working through each section with scientific thoroughness. High explosive shells tore apart trenches and bunkers. Shrapnel rounds burst overhead, showering defenders with deadly metal fragments. Gas shells released clouds of poison that seeped into every crack and crevice. In the first hour alone, over 100,000 shells crashed down on French positions. Men who had survived the battles of 1,914 and 1,915, veterans who thought they had seen the worst that war could offer, found themselves reduced to whimpering shadows. Some soldiers, driven beyond the limits of human endurance, simply ran screaming into no man's land, preferring the quick death of machine gun bullets to the endless torment of the bombardment. The French communication system, already fragile, disintegrated under the assault. Telephone lines were severed faster than they could be repaired. Radio stations were destroyed by direct hits. Runners sent to carry messages between positions disappeared into the maelstrom, their bodies lost among the countless shell craters that pocked the landscape. Within hours, French commanders had lost all contact with their forward positions. Colonel Émile Drion, commanding the chasseurs in the Bois des Corées, watched his carefully prepared positions evaporate under the German guns. His men, elite light infantry trained for rapid movement and marksmanship, found themselves buried alive as their trenches collapsed around them. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to splinters in minutes. The very ground seemed to liquefy under the constant impacts, creating a moonscape of overlapping craters filled with poisonous water and the remains of men and equipment. As the bombardment entered its second hour, then its third, a terrible realization dawned on those French soldiers still capable of coherent thought. This was not the preliminary bombardment they had experienced in previous battles, a violent but brief prelude to infantry assault. This was something entirely new, a systematic attempt to erase them from existence through sheer weight of explosives. The German gunners worked with mechanical precision, adjusting their fire based on reports from observation posts and aerial spotters. When one section of French trenches had been thoroughly pulverized, the barrage would shift to the next target, methodically working through the entire defensive system. It was warfare conducted like an industrial process, with human beings reduced to raw materials to be processed by the machinery of destruction. By noon, the French front line had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Trenches had been obliterated, strong points reduced to rubble, and entire companies simply vanished without trace. The few survivors huddled in shell holes or the remnants of deep bunkers, their minds shattered by hours of continuous bombardment. Some men were found days later, still trembling uncontrollably, their hair turned white from shock. Yet even as the German artillery methodically destroyed French positions, a remarkable transformation was taking place behind the lines. General Philippe Pétain, summoned from his headquarters to take command of the Second Army defending Verdun, arrived to find chaos but not despair. This gruff, methodical officer, who had spent decades studying defensive warfare, immediately grasped both the magnitude of the crisis and the opportunities it presented. Pétain understood that Verdun could not be held through the traditional methods of static defense. The German artillery was simply too powerful, their plan too well conceived. Instead, he would have to create an entirely new form of warfare, one that could absorb the German assault while maintaining the capacity to strike back. The key lay not in holding fixed positions, but in creating a flexible defense that could bend without breaking. The Sacred Way, that single road connecting Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, became the lifeline upon which everything depended. Pétain ordered that nothing but military traffic would be permitted on this vital artery. Trucks rolled day and night in endless convoys, carrying ammunition, supplies, and fresh troops to feed the battle. Every 14 seconds, another vehicle passed along the road, creating a mechanical river of men and material flowing toward the inferno. The logistics were staggering in their complexity. Each week, 90,000 troops traveled the Sacred Way, along with 50,000 tons of ammunition and supplies. The road surface, never designed for such traffic, began to disintegrate under the constant pounding of heavy trucks. Entire companies of soldiers were assigned to road maintenance, throwing down 700,000 tons of stone over the course of the battle to keep the route passable. Meanwhile, in the shattered landscape around Verdun, the German infantry began their advance. These were not the enthusiastic volunteers of 1,914 but hardened veterans, men who had learned to move carefully through the deadly terrain of modern battlefields. They advanced in small groups, using shell craters for cover, always ready to take shelter when French artillery responded. But as the German soldiers moved forward into what they expected to be empty trenches, they encountered something unexpected. The French had not been destroyed. Battered, bloodied, reduced in numbers, they were still there. From concealed positions in the rubble, machine guns opened fire. Hidden observers called down artillery strikes on the advancing Germans. What should have been a triumphal occupation became a deadly struggle for every yard of devastated ground. The most shocking blow came on February 25th, when Fort Douaumont, the strongest position in the entire Verdun fortress system, fell to a handful of German soldiers. The fort that should have anchored French resistance was captured without a fight, its skeleton garrison overwhelmed by a small raiding party that had simply walked through an unguarded entrance. The psychological impact was devastating. If mighty Douaumont could fall so easily, what hope was there for the rest of the defense? Yet even this humiliation contained the seeds of French revival. The loss of Douaumont became a rallying cry that echoed across France. Every newspaper carried the story. Every village church held prayers for the fortress's recapture. What had begun as a military disaster became a symbol of national resistance, proof that Verdun was worth any sacrifice to defend. As the news of Douaumont's fall spread through the corridors of power in Paris, the political ramifications became immediately clear. This was no longer merely a military engagement, but a test of France's very soul. General Joseph Joffre, the architect of victory at the Marne, found himself under intense pressure from politicians and press alike. The fortress that had been deliberately weakened was now in German hands, and the public demanded answers. But it was Philippe Pétain who understood the true nature of the struggle that lay ahead. Standing in his new headquarters at Souilly, this methodical general with penetrating eyes surveyed the maps that told the story of disaster and opportunity in equal measure. The German plan was brilliant in its simplicity, but it contained a fatal flaw. By choosing Verdun as their killing ground, they had selected a battlefield where French national honor would never permit retreat. The battle that emerged from those first terrible days was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. This was not the swift cavalry charges of Napoleon or the massed infantry assaults of earlier wars. Instead, Verdun became a factory of death operating 24 hours a day, consuming men and material at rates that defied comprehension. Every dawn brought fresh horrors. Every sunset counted the cost in thousands of casualties. The German advance continued with mechanical precision. Village after village fell to their methodical assault. Haumont, Brabant, Samogneux, names that had dotted French maps for centuries, were erased in days of fighting. German stormtroopers, armed with flamethrowers and grenades, cleared French positions with ruthless efficiency. Behind them came waves of infantry, consolidating each gain before pressing forward to the next objective. Yet with every yard they advanced, the Germans found their casualties mounting. The French had learned to fight differently here. Gone were the massed formations that had been slaughtered in 1914 and 1915. Instead, small groups of defenders used the cratered landscape to their advantage, appearing suddenly to deliver devastating fire before melting back into the rubble. Every shell hole became a fortress, every ruined building a strong point. The artillery duel that raged above this infantry struggle defied all previous measures of destruction. German batteries, firing from carefully concealed positions, poured shells into French lines with scientific precision, but the French guns answered with equal fury, their fire directed by observers hidden in the shattered forests and ruins. The mathematical exchange was brutal in its simplicity. For every shell the Germans fired, the French replied with one of their own. The earth itself seemed to rebel against this treatment, the constant explosions creating a landscape that resembled the surface of an alien planet. French artillery tactics evolved with deadly innovation under the pressure of survival. Pétain organized his guns into groups that could concentrate fire rapidly on threatened sectors. When German attacks developed, hundreds of guns would suddenly focus their fire on the advancing infantry, creating walls of steel that no human force could penetrate. The technique, known as the barrage roulant or rolling barrage, became a signature of French defensive tactics, refined through months of desperate fighting. The human cost of this mechanical warfare was staggering beyond comprehension. Entire battalions vanished in single days of fighting. Companies that marched into the line, 800 strong, emerged with fewer than 50 men. The wounded streamed back along the sacred way in endless processions, their faces bearing the hollow stare of men who had seen too much. Field hospitals, overwhelmed by the casualty flow, operated in conditions that belonged more to the Dark Ages than the 20th century. Medical innovations born of necessity transformed battlefield medicine during these months of horror. French doctors learned to perform surgery under artillery fire, to treat wounds caused by weapons no medical textbook had described. Shell shock, that mysterious ailment that left strong men trembling like children, appeared with such frequency that entirely new treatments had to be developed. The psychological casualties often outnumbered the physical ones, as men's minds shattered under pressures no human being was designed to endure. The French rotation system, implemented by Pétain with characteristic thoroughness, became the key to survival. Rather than leaving units in the line until they were destroyed, French divisions were rotated through Verdun on a regular basis. Fresh troops replaced exhausted ones before they reached the breaking point. This system, revolutionary for its time, meant that the burden of Verdun was shared across the entire French army rather than concentrated on a few unlucky divisions. By summer, the battle had developed its own terrible rhythm. German attacks would surge forward, gaining a few hundred yards at enormous cost. French counterattacks would follow, equally costly, sometimes recapturing lost ground, sometimes failing with appalling casualties. The front lines shifted back and forth across the same devastated terrain, each attack adding another layer to the carpet of corpses that covered the battlefield. The weather itself seemed to conspire against the combatants. Summer heat turned the battlefield into a furnace where the stench of death became unbearable. Corpses, impossible to bury under the constant bombardment, decomposed in the open air, creating clouds of flies that tormented the living. Water became contaminated with the runoff from mass graves. Disease spread through the trenches with the same efficiency as artillery shells. As autumn approached, both armies showed signs of the terrible strain. German units, initially confident of quick victory, found themselves trapped in a battle of attrition that their doctrine had never anticipated. The methodical advance had slowed to a crawl, with each objective costing more than the last. Fresh divisions fed into the Verdun furnace emerged as hollow shells of their former strength. French morale, tested to its very limits, somehow held firm. The knowledge that they were defending French soil, that every yard of ground was precious beyond price, sustained men through ordeals that should have broken them. Letters home spoke not of despair but of grim determination. This was their land, their heritage, and they would not yield it easily. The technological innovations spawned by Verdun's demands changed warfare forever. Aircraft, initially used only for reconnaissance, evolved into fighters and bombers as the battle progressed. The skies above Verdun became contested airspace where German and French pilots fought duels among the clouds. Aerial photography, pioneered at Verdun, allowed commanders to see the battlefield with unprecedented clarity. Underground warfare reached new levels of sophistication as both sides tunneled beneath no man's land. Miners worked in shifts, digging galleries toward enemy positions while listening for the sound of opposing tunnels. When these subterranean passages met, brutal hand-to-hand fighting erupted in spaces barely large enough for men to stand. The explosion of mines became a regular feature of the battle, creating new craters in landscape already torn beyond recognition. By winter, Verdun had become more than a battle. It had become a symbol that transcended military strategy. For France, it represented the unbreakable spirit of the nation, proof that no sacrifice was too great to preserve the homeland. For Germany, it had become a millstone, draining resources and manpower that could have been used elsewhere. For the world, it demonstrated the terrible efficiency with which modern warfare could destroy both men and landscape. The villages that had once dotted the battlefield existed now only in memory. Their names lived on in military dispatches and casualty reports, but the places themselves had been erased as thoroughly as if they had never been. The forests where children had once played were reduced to fields of splintered stumps. The rivers ran red with more than mud. Yet through all this destruction, the human spirit endured. In letters written by candlelight in dugouts, soldiers spoke of home, of families, of hopes for peace. In field hospitals, nurses worked miracles of healing amid conditions that defied description. In headquarters behind the lines, commanders planned not just for survival but for eventual victory. Verdun was destroying much, but it was also revealing the depths of human courage and determination. The battle had become a test not just of military strength but of national character. Each shell that fell, each charge that was repulsed, each counterattack that gained a few precious yards added another page to an epic that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. This was warfare stripped to its essence, revealing both the worst and the best of what human beings were capable of achieving. When the guns finally fell silent on December 18th, 1916, after 300 days of continuous slaughter, the fields around Verdun bore scars that would never heal. 700,000 men had been fed into this machinery of death. Their sacrifice measured not in territory gained or strategic objectives achieved, but in the simple fact that France still stood. The German dream of bleeding France white had failed, but at a cost that defied comprehension. Verdun had become more than a battle. It had become the crucible where modern warfare revealed its true face, where the romantic illusions of glory and honor were finally buried beneath mountains of shell-torn earth. The men who survived carried with them memories of hell itself, while the dead remained forever in soil that would yield unexploded shells and fragments of bone for generations to come. In the end, Verdun's greatest victory was not tactical but spiritual, proving that some things are worth defending regardless of the price, and that the human spirit, tested beyond all reasonable limits, can still endure.